Beloved hands of the cause of God, counselors and dear friends, while writing this paper, I wept. And since what I had sensed for a very long time was absolutely confirmed, that is, that the reality of the Guardian is closely collaborating with the Universal House of Justice. While studying the book, The World Order of Baha'u'llah, I couldn't help thinking about what was going on during the time it was being written. It was a turbulent period. For some, a time of dangerous uncertainty. For others, a time of great promise, especially for those following the powerful populists of the day, Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. These men were dazzling their constituents and others with utopian-type promises that generated hope in their hearts and pride in their nation. And they seemed to be men of their word, for they managed to generate fast, dramatic results. Millions of people were drawn into these so-called saviors, some from different lands. Certainly the Great Depression was a factor in attracting so many devoted adherents. But it was more than that. Many who followed Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin saw themselves for the first time in their lives part of a mighty mission that would undo the wrongs of the past while securing a resplendent future. Even the poet Ezra Pound was lured by Mussolini's dream of reviving the Roman Empire. Scientists, churchmen, professors, composers were swayed by Hitler's cry of Germany today, tomorrow the world. And many social idealists around the world viewed the Bolshevik effort in the Soviet Union as the building of paradise on earth. The exploits of these magnetic leaders were reported almost daily in the world's press. Radio commentators followed their activities regularly with a sense of awe. And in the midst of this commotion over these charismatic ideologues, the League of Nations, a world agency conceived to maintain global peace, was collapsing. Now, watching all of this from the heart of the mountain of God in the Holy Land was the leader of a fledgling faith who was aware of the perilous course humanity was on and why it was moving in that direction. He also knew what could reverse that course. Yet no front-page articles appeared in the New York Times, Le Monde, and the Toronto Globe Mail about what Shoghi Effendi knew. It was no secret. He had shared his vision, which after all was a reminder to a bewildered world that God had indeed passed by, delivering a message that not only could heal the social and spiritual ailments that truly plague humanity, but provide the way to create that long-sought world civilization, the kingdom of God on earth. Unfortunately, not many people heard the Guardian's call. Or if they did, they didn't grasp its magnitude, its relevance to humanity's destiny. His voice was drowned out by the shrill pronouncements of popular demagogues. But then again, Shoghi Effendi's call was like the first streaks of the light of day. About 50 years later, as the Bahá'í Faith emerges from obscurity, Shoghi Effendi's vision is beginning to be studied seriously, while the doctrines of Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin are categorized as words of madmen. In time, many people will eventually see what Shoghi Effendi saw. mainly because it makes so much sense. Certainly my view stems from a faith bias. But I'm reminded of a friend of mine, a journalist for a leading American newspaper, who marveled over Shoghi Effendi's vision. He became a Baha'i even though he had doubts about the existence of God. It was the reasonableness, the practicality, the scope of Baha'u'llah's world order as described by Shoghi Effendi that drew him into the faith. To him, there was no comparable global peace plan. He had to be a part of it. Incidentally, my friend developed a deep love for God. In studying the book, The World Order of Baha'u'llah, I was also struck by the realization of what its comments represent. The thought of a builder came to mind. Certainly not the kind we are familiar with, yet similar in some respects. When you think of a successful builder, you think of someone who by nature is persistent, a doer, a perfectionist, capable of producing a structure that reflects the spirit and letter of the architect's blueprint. Shoghi Effendi possessed those qualities. But since he had to build something unprecedented, other qualities were required. Humility, love, devotion, compassion, faith, patience, and above all, sacrifice. You see, not many are called to construct the superstructure of a divine civilization. The requirements are unique. You can't advertise in the local newspapers for construction workers, nor would the telephone book's yellow pages help. And there aren't any schools that train that kind of specialty. So, Shoghi Effendi had to take on that training responsibility, something he carried out by calling periodic conferences, institutes, encouraging the formation of summer schools, and generating a steady flow of messages to the believers around the world, especially in America, which the Master said would play a dominant role in the building process. Part of the Guardian's educational program was to provide the believers with a clear view of what their labors would help to erect. He understood that without vision, motivation would wane. Worse still, the friends would unwittingly exercise an obsolete concept of faith, blind obedience, instead of the Baha'i concept, enlightened obedience. Through such sources as the Kitab-i Aqdas, Abdu'l-Baha's Will and Testament, and the Tablets of the Divine Plan, Shoghi Effendi pieced together a view of the future representing the world salvation that past prophets had promised. Now, in studying the world order of Baha'u'llah, which actually is a series of 1929 to 1936 messages to the North American believers, I got the impression that Shoghi Effendi was telling me that I have a role in helping to construct Baha'u'llah's divine civilization. Suddenly it dawned on me that I was one of the Guardian's construction workers. For years I had spent much of my time as a Baha'i admiring Shoghi Effendi's vision of the future as one would admire a Rembrandt, even analyzing it for others' people's benefit. I thought. This must be one way the Guardian found his workers. Another thought followed immediately. How patient Shoghi Effendi was, and how painful it must have been to be so patient, for he longed so to carry out the Master's plans. What was about his messages, I thought further, that helped me to gain new understanding? Upon reflection, I realized that part of the answer was in the way the messages were constructed. They opened my eyes. They opened my heart. For this reason, it's important for me to focus briefly on Shoghi Effendi's writing style. Now, using the word style bothers me because it presupposes an attempt by the writer to impress his critics or to strive for literary distinction. I don't believe that Shoghi Effendi thought of that while writing. Though his prose seemed carefully thought out and each word precisely measured to accurately convey its intended meaning, what he wrote seems to spring from his heart. A current of concern runs through his writing, the kind of concern a true brother would show for a loved one. While the voice is compassionate in tone, it generates respect for the writer without demanding it. There's also a yearning in his writing, voice, a yearning for the reader to grasp the gravity of his message. Yet it is always reassuring and never guilt-producing. At times it is a cry for the reader to awaken, to extinguish the flames enveloping his house. But it's not a desperate cry, for it stems from a conviction that is divinely based. True, his prose is heavy in texture, but then he was writing about weighty matters. His works are meant to be pondered, not perused. They seem timeless, as relevant today as when he wrote them. It's important to note that while Shoghi Effendi was training the believers, he had other duties to attend to, among them translating the works of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha into English, establishing the Faith's World Center, designing and coordinating the landscaping of the holy places, hammering out the administrative order as outlined by Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha. And there was his diplomatic responsibilities with the rulers of Palestine and later Israel. Any one of those responsibilities would have constituted a full-time commitment for someone else. But there was even more work, perhaps the most important of all. A Herculean effort had to be made to sift out whatever poison the covenant breakers had spread through the body of believers. And while doing that, he led the defense against the continual assaults of covenant breakers and enemies of the faith. While attending to all of this, Shoghi Effendi kept training the friends. Now, most successful teachers have a curriculum designed to cover a certain amount of material, and the curriculum requires considerable calculation. Upon reflection, I don't think Shoghi Effendi approached his educational program that way. What he covered and how he communicated it resulted from inspiration. If a label must be given to his training approach, then let's call it the progressive revelation method. What was stressed in the outset was basic, for considerable groundwork was necessary before a plan could be issued. The Friends weren't ready for one in 1921, and certainly in 1929, and certainly not in 1921. Conditioning was needed. The believers needed perspective as to why and how a divine civilization must be built. But most of all, their faith needed shoring up. To accomplish this, he exuded confidence that the cause was on firm ground. Sensing the uneasiness of some of the North American Baha'is concerning the attacks on the faith from within and without, Shoghi Effendi assured them that the assaults would only further the growth of their cause. Explaining the administrative order had to be done because it represented the nucleus, the very pattern of what Baha'is had to develop, namely the world order of Baha'u'llah. And that wasn't easy to do, because to many Baha'is in the 20s and 30s, administration seemed foreign, since Abdu'l-Baha hadn't stressed it during his lifetime, though he had made provisions for it in his will and testament. There were believers in North America who resisted organizing the faith in any way, thinking it would impede the flow of the Holy Spirit in their community and cause discord. To allay such fares, Shoghi Effendi wrote, the administration of the cause is to be conceived as an instrument and not a substitute for the faith of Baha'u'llah, that it should be regarded as a channel through which his promised blessings may flow, that it should guard against such rigidity as would clog and fetter the liberating forces released by Baha'u'llah's revelation. He explained how the spiritual assemblies are to be formed and function. And in outlining their structure, Shoghi Effendi pointed out that as the faith matures, the spiritual assemblies will change in style with greater membership and acceptance from the community at large. Their powers and functions will increase. The Universal House of Justice and the guardianship are discussed in a way as to assure the friends of the rock firmness of the cause, and that these twin institutions make up an impregnable scheme against schism. He also familiarizes the friends with how those institutions would function, explaining, for example, that the Universal House of Justice is empowered to legislate on matters never addressed by the central figures of the faith, that it also can repeal whatever was enacted by previous houses of justice. After describing how the Supreme Body is elected, he reveals an incident that occurred in the Master's day, which underscores the importance of the Universal House of Justice to the life of the cause. Abdu'l-Baha was preparing to call an election when his life was being threatened in 1907 and 1908. It was an action that had to be taken. Without a central authority, the faith of Baha'u'llah could be destroyed. Shoghi Effendi was only 10 at the time. Fortunately, unrest in the Turkish government curtailed the plot against the Master, and he was freed after 55 years as a prisoner. Shoghi Effendi described the function of the Universal House of Justice in a way that generated confidence in the believers in regards to the faith's future. For with its establishment, the roots of the cause were safeguarded. So the friends looked forward to the day the Supreme Body would be elected. Somehow Shoghi Effendi was able to keep alive the feeling of great expectations among the Baha'is. That was evident every time one of the messages reached North America. There was always a rush to study it. As for the guardianship, Shoghi Effendi explained that it was a complementary institution to the Universal House of Justice. He stated, that it enhances the prestige of the exalted assembly, stabilizes its supreme position, safeguards its unity, assures the continuity of its labors without presuming in the slightest to infringe upon the inviolability of its clearly defined sphere of jurisdiction. What isn't stated, however, but is now evident to those studying the period of Abdu'l-Baha's passing, is that without the guardianship, the faith would most likely have collapsed. Consider the North American situation at the time. There were a few thousand believers in varying degrees of spiritual maturity. Glib, charismatic Persian covenant breakers were trying to generate a following. Sincere, devoted believers who revered the Master seemed lost without him. Whatever organization existed was relatively new and preoccupied for the most part in building the temple. There were unity problems. The Chicago community, the site of America's first assembly, was in disarray. 2 assemblies were functioning there, both bitterly opposed to each other. Of course, this was going on when communication had been cut off with the Master during World War I. Shortly after communication with Abdu'l-Baha was restored, the discord ended. When the contents of the Will and Testament was unveiled, many North American Baha'is were relieved, for the guardian was viewed as an extension of Abdu'l-Baha. Someone linked to Baha'u'llah was needed in 1929 to draw together all of the differing elements in the faith. Shoghi Effendi was able to do that. In training the friends, Shoghi Effendi assured them that what happened to other religions wouldn't happen to the Bahá'í Faith. He did this by emphasizing the uniqueness of Baha'u'llah's administrative order, pointing out how different it is in origin and practice from other religious organizational systems, the basic difference being the administrative order's divinely ordained institutions. He cites the Aqdas and the Master's will and testament as evidence. In comparing the faith's administrative order with the systems used in Islam and Christendom, he boldly exposes the artificiality of some of their practices, no doubt an eye-opener for many of the friends, especially in the West. For example, he claims that, quote, the unity of the Church of Christ was irretrievably shattered. Shoghi Effendi doesn't spare the other old world institutions. The world's political systems, he adds, are as bankrupt as the religious orders of the day. In a powerful way, he describes how inadequate the existing governmental, economic, and social apparati are in coping with mounting, pressing problems that, if unchecked, could devour civilization. What Shoghi Effendi does is elucidate for the believers the disintegration-integration process that was unleashed into the world with Baha'u'llah's coming. In doing so, he helps the Baha'is to see how futile it would be to expect the prevailing forces to lead humanity out of the hell it has created for itself. On the other hand, he impresses them with the importance of committing themselves to a cause that is God-sent and that is charged with unifying and spiritualizing the human family. To achieve this goal, he reminds the friends, requires a consciousness of the oneness of mankind, that all who labor to build the world order of Baha'u'llah must strive to attain such an awareness. No statesman, no cleric, however popular he may be, no church or sect, no political ideology or economic scheme is capable of transforming on a global scale the bigoted mind into a free and all-accepting mind. What it takes, he instructs the friends, is, quote, an organic change in the structure of present-day society, a change such as the world has not yet experienced. It constitutes a challenge at once bold and universal to outworn shibboleths of national creeds that have had their day, and which must, in the ordinary course of events, as shaped and controlled by Providence, give way to a new gospel, fundamentally different from and infinitely superior to what the world has already conceived. It calls for no less than the reconstruction and the demilitarization of the whole civilized world, a world organically unified in all aspects of life, its political machinery, its spiritual aspiration, its trade and finance, its script and language, and yet infinite in the diversity and national characteristics of its federated units. He goes on to say that nothing short of a power that is born of God can succeed in establishing it. Shoghi Effendi looked to America for many of his workers, actually following Abdu'l-Baha's lead. For the Master had said, quote, the American people are indeed worthy of being the first to build the tabernacle of the great peace and proclaim the oneness of mankind. So the Guardian continually reminded the Americans of their great destiny and urged them to put forth an extra measure for the development of the cause. Whatever he asked the American Baha'is to do, he knew they had the means to carry it out. The way he made his appeal usually stirred the Americans to achieve what at first glance seemed impossible for them to do. In a sense, he knew the Americans much better than themselves. So it wasn't by accident that the Americans distinguished themselves in the pioneering field. Obviously, Shoghi Effendi realized that in training the believers, he had the responsibility of not only lifting their vision to Baha'u'llah, but also of keeping alive the fire of love for him in their hearts. In doing that, he takes the believer to the highest summit, away from the hurly-burly of the world, to hear in the manifestation's own words the significance of his mission. In reverence for Baha'u'llah, Shoghi Effendi doesn't summarize the Blessed Beauty's proclamations. They come to the believer clear, unadulterated, like a mighty trumpet call resounding through the world and through the ages. I testify before God to the greatness, the inconceivable greatness of the revelation. Again and again have we in our tablets borne witness to this truth, that mankind may be roused from its heedlessness. In this most mighty revelation, all the dispensations of the past have attained their highest, their final consummation. That which hath been manifest in this preeminent, this most exalted revelation, stands unparalleled in the annals of the past, nor will future ages witness its like. Because Shoghi Effendi's training wouldn't be complete without clarifying the linkage between the central figures of the faith, he took that task on too. He uses quotes from the Bab and Baha'u'llah to explain their unique relationship. He upholds the legitimacy of the Bab as a manifestation in his own right, and does this in such a reverent manner that the believer stands in awe of the Bab's sacrifices. As for Abdul-Baha, Shoghi Effendi comes closer than anyone else in this century in explaining his grandfather's essence. Quote, in the person of Abdul-Baha, the incompatible characteristics of a human nature and superhuman knowledge and perfection have been blended and are completely harmonized. By proclaiming that Abdul-Baha was the perfect human exemplar of Baha'u'llah's teaching, the guardian provided the believers with a role model to follow in their struggle to develop spiritually. And he continually reminded them to strive to emulate the Master. Shoghi Effendi certainly did. Their relationship transcended the normal grandfather-grandson relationship. Even as a child, he was drawn to Abdul-Baha. His greatest longing prior to assuming the guardianship was to spend his life serving the Master. Considering what he accomplished, it is evident that Shoghi Effendi really fulfilled his youthful yearning in a manner that must thrill the heart of Abdul-Baha. Shoghi Effendi was realistic in his training approach. While channeling Baha'u'llah's glorious vision of the future to the Baha'is, he pointed out that it wouldn't materialize without much travail and sorrow. And he didn't guarantee the Baha'is immunity to hardship. As his training program progressed, the vision of the divine civilization the Baha'is were charged with constructing became clearer to them. Maybe it was because Shoghi Effendi continually focused attention to it that the believers saw things in the vision they hadn't seen before. What once appeared fantasy-like now seemed attainable. By 1936, the Friends were far more stable than in 1921. Not many of them realized that the letters that make up the book, The World Order of Baha'u'llah, would evolve into a manual for conditioning Baha'is to become divine civilization workers. After 15 years as guardian, Shoghi Effendi finally launched the first phase of what was supposed to be an ongoing plan of global spiritual conquest. It was called the First 7-Year Plan and was directed primarily for the American Baha'is. He unveiled others in his lifetime, among them the Second 7-Year Plan and the 10-Year Crusade. Of course, the introduction of plans didn't stop Shoghi Effendi's training program. It had to be continued. While the Baha'is in 1937 were generally more mature than earlier believers, they weren't perfect spiritual specimens. At the outset, Shoghi Effendi's expansion scheme didn't impress many outside objective social observers, or for that matter, some immature Baha'is. Superficially, the first 7-year plan lacked the romantic appeal of Marxism. But the critics couldn't see what Shoghi Effendi saw, for they didn't understand the organic nature of the Bahá'í Faith. To Shoghi Effendi, the faith grows, it doesn't expand, much like the difference between planting and building a brick wall. From the tree, another one springs up, negotiating every aspect of his life. He is involved in a cycle whereby devotion to regular prayer and study of the writings draws him further into the world of the spirit, where a sense of security and well-being reinforces his growing desire to pray and deepen. This continues until he begins to recognize and appreciate the power of his revelation. Because of this power, the only Baha'i on a tiny island or a big city is potentially a group, a local spiritual assembly, a community, and a pioneer-producing center. When Shoghi Effendi revealed the first 7-year plan, there were no living hands of the cause of God, no counselors, no auxiliary board members, and their assistants. There were only 8 national spiritual assemblies and a few local spiritual assemblies, most of them plagued with the kind of problems fledgling institutions suffer from. He didn't allow the immaturity of the assemblies to deter him from setting in motion the mechanism for further collective growth in the faith. He knew that in time, through prayer and deepening, the infant institutions, often wobbly and fumbling, would grow stronger and one day evolve into houses of justice. Certainly the goals of the first 7-year plan pale in comparison with the international 7-year plan launched in 1979. In 44 years, considerable growth has taken place. 140 national spiritual assemblies, nearly 30,000 local spiritual assemblies, and Baha'is residing in 113,000 localities in the world. Consider what the number will be in the year 2000. And what about 2050, or the year 2500? In his 36 years as guardian, Shoghi Effendi galvanized the Baha'i world. The significance of that achievement isn't known to most people. In the future, it will be common knowledge that Shoghi Effendi forged the divine civilization's foundation. They'll also recognize that he created the pattern for further construction of that civilization. Evidence of that is already apparent. The plans issued by the Universal House of Justice are modeled after the Guardian's plans. Shoghi Effendi was truly a historic figure, far greater in reality than his contemporaries, who gained greater recognition in their lifetimes. Unlike them, he didn't seek personal publicity or lust for power. His was a divine mission, and he dedicated his life to it, allowing absolutely nothing to deter him from fulfilling everything that was expected of him. Those who really knew him might say he had been chosen to carry out what God had willed. In witnessing Shoghi Effendi's involvement in that process, they experienced an expression of sacrifice that transformed their lives and touched thousands of others. He was a tender teacher who enlightened those who were willing to be taught. In a way, he was a far-reaching light that guided the Baha'is through the darkened wastelands of decaying civilizations to the mountaintop to hear Baha'u'llah's call. That light, in terms of his 36,000 letters and messages, as well as his translations and plans, is still illuminating the path to a glorious future for a terribly troubled humanity. In basic earthly terms, the light of Shoghi Effendi expired, but only as his grandfather expected it would. Behold the candle, how it gives its light. It weeps its life away, drop by drop, to give forth its flame of light.